It's the world's most popular role-playing game by a pretty comfortable margin. It's a bestseller and has become a huge touchstone both in the cultural zeitgeist and in the realms and stores where we play our role-playing games. Dungeons & Dragons is the big guy on the block, but the fact of the matter remains, I don't play Dungeons & Dragons anymore. Hi, I'm Kyle. I'm the Dork, and for most of you, I imagine this is the first time you're seeing my face. Hi, how you doing? I wanted to start this new year off with this video because it was one that you requested a while ago. I got sick over the break, and it made it impossible for me to record or work, which was really hard for me. And I wanted to start the new year off swinging, and this was a video that had been widely requested. So, before we get started, I want to talk about what this video will not be. If you're a fan of Dungeons & Dragons, this video is not going to be me trashing you or saying that you're bad for liking this game. I understand that D&D has gotten a great number of folks into role-playing games and storytelling games in general, and I think that in totality, I think it's been a good thing for the tabletop hobby. But for myself and for a number of other GMs that I know, it's become a system that we loved and is not a system that we love any longer. Now, part of the reason I want to address this with my actual face is there's a personal connection that I have to D&D. Many of the personal connections that I enjoy, both professionally and among my friends, I owe to this game, but the fact of the matter remains, I have lost the love that I had for D&D. So this is not going to be me trashing the people who like it, or in many cases the designers who work really hard on it, the companies that make great supplements for it. And one more thing, before we get too far into this, I'm going to co-opt some arguments. A lot of people in the comments when I do these videos generally tend to respond with something like, you're a bad GM, or you can just fix this, or you can change these things. I am aware that I can change anything at a table, and that most of the time the experience is on me. However, my arguments and my opinions are that Dungeons & Dragons as a system has enough flaws and issues present in it that I don't want to have to do it. Or, to quote another person that I know who's a published game designer, at some point, making the game work on the first try is not my job, it's yours. But before we start, I have to talk about what D&D does well, because I need to co-opt another argument that I get quite a lot when I do these videos, and I try to critique or dissect something that has a rabid fan base, a fan base that enjoys it. One of the things that comes up often is, oh, I clearly don't have an understanding of or an appreciation for the thing that I am critiquing. I have played Dungeons & Dragons in some way, shape, or form since I was 8 years old. I began in 3rd edition, but I've played every single edition and have stopped at 5th, and I believe my critique comes from a place both of appreciation for the game and understanding of it. But before we start into a critical dissection, I have to talk about what Dungeons & Dragons does well, because in understanding of the game's strengths, we can better understand and critique its weaknesses. The first thing that D&D does very, very well is its simplicity. Underneath all of the different pages, all of the handbooks, the supplements, the campaign settings, the stuff on Roll20 and D&D Beyond that you can layer and layer and layer on top of a character, of the prestiges and all of the complexity, is a very simple foundation. Roll the 20-sided die, high number good, low number bad. I recently got to play 5th edition with a group of players, many of whom had either not played in a number of years, and some of whom had only begun playing for the first time. And despite their confusion about the modifiers, about what their character could and could not do, their difficulty in parsing some of the rules, they could come to a fundamental understanding that as long as the roll of a 20-sided dice was high enough, they could do whatever it is that they wanted. This is a very simple vehicle to imagination. A D20 is not simply a dice, it is a portal to another dimension, and an understanding of that D20 is not something that you have to have a college-level math degree or an understanding of advanced mechanics to make work. It is what Dungeons & Dragons does best, because I can seriously just hand a 20-sided die to a 4th grader, and I can say, if you want to hit the troll, you have to roll high enough. And this is a true and excellent strength. Another one of the ones that I think has allowed Dungeons & Dragons to continue its dominance of the role-playing game landscape is that it is culturally and historically entrenched. I think it is very difficult to explain to people that we are just now beginning to have a role-playing game renaissance. Before Dungeons & Dragons, there were role-playing games to be sure, and people have always played pretend, but D&D is the one to do it the biggest and hit the main stage first and the hardest, and as a result of that, Dungeons & Dragons enjoys a cultural cachet that no other game or title does. Everything from Stranger Things, which has dominated Netflix, the Satanic Panic back in the 70s, to more modern things like Fantasy High or Critical Role, has allowed Dungeons & Dragons to continue to build up its cultural cachet and infect the zeitgeist in a way that allows it to sell out Madison Square Gardens so long as Matt Mercer is the one GMing. It's really important for us to understand that part of D&D's success, at least in my opinion, comes from incumbency advantage. It's easy for us to take into account that when you're trying to introduce role-playing games to somebody, you don't have to introduce them to your favorite esoteric one or to something that's, formidable but perhaps more fun, like Morkborg or You Have Always Lived in the Lighthouse, a shameless self-plug. But again, its cultural cachet and its importance both historically and culturally cannot be overstated. Also, I really do think it's important for us to look at Dungeons & Dragons inspirations and the link of those inspirations to both popular literature and popular culture. It's no accident that Dungeons & Dragons is based on the fantastical works of J.R.R. Tolkien, specifically The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, but also on the myths that those books were inspired by, things like the Song of Roland, the Tales of King Arthur, or the myths of Beowulf. To say that D&D is just a game, I think, is an issue and a vast understatement or oversimplification of it. Dungeons & Dragons is, at its very DNA, interwoven with the myths, legends, and stories of the human race, and I think that's part of what has given it as much oomph and as much panache as it has continued to enjoy. It's also clear that eldritch horror, in some small way, does play a part of Dungeons & Dragons role-playing, and these two very important literature and cultural touchstones, both in eldritch and cosmic horror and in the myths and legends of our very history, is part of what makes Dungeons & Dragons both so exciting and instantly accessible to newer players. But I think the last thing, and this is the one thing that nobody freaking talks about when we talk about Dungeons & Dragons, the most important strength of this game is that D&D lends itself to customization, house rules, and adaptation. Anytime that I'm talking to fans of Dungeons & Dragons who don't like my take that I think the game is, and I'm going to say this right now, I think the game is bad, and I think the game doesn't really work on a fundamental level, the argument usually comes to, oh, why don't you just house rule something? Why don't you just ignore that? Why don't you just move beyond that one part? And my issues with this are that I have to house rule and house blend and get things out and change things around so much to turn Dungeons & Dragons into something I like playing that at some point I might as well just start making my own role-playing games. Shocker, it's what I did as a company. But this argument has led me to the realization of what is Dungeons & Dragons' greatest and most fundamental strength. See, Dungeons & Dragons is a lot like vanilla ice cream. It might not be my most important or most exciting or most favorite flavor of ice cream, but it is, in and of itself, infinitely customizable. Plain vanilla ice cream takes very, very, very different than something like a low-fat vanilla ice cream with fresh fruit and low-fat chocolate chips. That tastes very different than a classic sundae with hot fudge drizzle and whipped cream and all of the toppings, which tastes very different than a vanilla ice cream with Reese's Cups and peanut butter drizzle on that. You see, the thing is, Dungeons & Dragons' greatest strength isn't that D&D is a game, it's that D&D is a freaking canvas upon which anyone, from an inexperienced GM first cracking open a rulebook on Christmas Day to somebody who has been playing for 40 odd years, can paint their own pictures. D&D is infinitely customizable, it is infinitely accessible, and it is infinitely adaptable, and that is ultimately its biggest strength. But I'm going to argue that it is adaptable because it is essentially has to be because the rules are fundamentally flawed in a way that they will never really truly work for any one group. It is accessible because it tries nothing exciting or does nothing to challenge its players in a systemic way. And again, I do think this is D&D's greatest strength, but I also think the game has been kept alive by a wonderful ecosystem of folk GMs and storytellers. But before we talk about my rules and my problems with them, I do have to talk about Wizards of the Coast first, because a lot of my issues and some of the stomach problem that I have with D&D comes not from the game, but from the company itself. There's an argument, I think, to be made about separating the art from the artist, and if you're able to do that, more power to you. However, myself, as somebody who owns a publisher and works with artists of all stripes and tries to elevate the community around me, it's become really hard for me to stomach playing Dungeons & Dragons when the company behind it makes such odious and difficult to deal with decisions on a daily and in some case monthly basis. One of the big issues with D&D is that it seems in many cases that it's turned against its community. Many of us remember the open game license scandal that happened a few earlier last year or 2 years ago. For those not in the know, the open gaming license was an understanding between Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast and independent creators that allowed them to make their own types of games and their own supplementary products using Dungeons & Dragons rules or key characters and components, things like the Forgotten Realms or Beholders, for example. When this happened, the reason the open game license happened is after or during 3rd edition, Dungeons & Dragons was struggling financially, and the design team behind it realized that there was an entirely untapped potential to open the game up to folk GMs and folk designers, individuals who had their own communities but weren't necessarily tapped into Wizards of the Coast or to the zeitgeist of organized play, and to allow them to do this. This gave rise to an incredible cottage industry of artists, map makers, game masters, and players who all worked under the open gaming license, and Hasbro pulling it at the last second was a pretty scumbag move that threatened the livelihoods of hundreds, if not thousands, of independent creators. Another thing that I take huge umbrage with is that Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro, by extension, is a company that has the ability to support its staff, to support its members and its workers, and it chooses on pretty much every case not to do so. Last year, we were hit with not one, but 2 waves of layoffs, resulting in about 2,000 jobs being lost, 1,000 of those being literally right before Christmas. Again, this is a huge deal when the teams that were affected were the ones making the company money, and when those layoffs were juxtaposed with massive bonuses for the executive C-suite members at Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast. Now, you might be saying, Kyle, that's just how late-stage capitalism works, and you're not necessarily wrong, but I, as somebody who is able to make role-playing games and as somebody who is in the ecosystem, I do get to choose how I participate in that ecosystem, and I have a really hard time when a company posts record profits and record prices and then follows that up by laying off the individuals whose labor and whose work contributed to the success of those games and of those products. I take umbrage with that as somebody who works to try and employ their own independent creatives and creative teams. Another issue that I take issue with Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro has been their use of AI-generated art. Now, I can understand, I don't agree, but I can at least understand the argument of using AI-generated art or materials if you are a small creator that does not have access to a talented design team or somebody that's willing to work within the constraints of your budget. That makes sense to me, even though I don't necessarily agree with it, and there are resources available to a cash-strapped or first-time designer. I will hopefully, if I remember to do so, link some of those resources below. But you, and if you don't know this, you will know this now, should know that I am deeply, deeply opposed to the commercial use of AI art in games. I think it robs games of the humanity that makes them interesting. I think it robs storytelling games of the impetus, the drive, the push that makes them a compelling thing to take part in, and I think it robs individuals of a chance to take part in the industry as well. An opportunity that I don't take lightly because I made Desks and Dorks to give myself and others that opportunity that I felt like I was not being given by the industry at large. Wizards of the Coast had said multiple times that it was not going to use AI art, and then shockingly enough was caught using AI art and then abruptly reversed course. Again, I understand, I don't agree, but And I understand if you are a small, cash-strapped, independent creator. What I don't understand is that if you are working in a hobby license that literally prints you money, why you can't afford to pay artists, especially because there are so many great artists that are trying to get work and are capable of making incredible things. Humans buy your games, humans play your games, humans should be the one making your games, and I believe very firmly and very strongly in that. This is an odious and I think awful decision on their part, and it's one that has made my continued enjoyment of Wizards of the Coast products, whether that be Magic the Gathering or Dungeons and Dragons, to be something that I just don't feel like I'm comfortable with moving forward personally or professionally. The core of this boils down to a couple different things, but I want to start with our base foundation, and that is the fact that D&D's system does not support role-playing in the way that I want. When I want you to consider Dungeons & Dragons, I want you to think of it not as a game system or as even as a canvas, as I had laid out earlier, but as an amusement park, a place that a player, in this case a guest of the amusement park, can come in and experiment with the rides in however they wish. But a theme park has themes, it has areas. You might think of Disney World, for example, and I don't even think Dungeons & Dragons does that much to guide or help cultivate its player base. No, I think D&D is a lot like a state fair, where there's just an assortment of rides and you can pick and choose what you want. Now, this approach is great and it is accessible. That is another strength of Dungeons & Dragons as a system, its accessibility and its invitation to all players to come in and experiment and enjoy however or whatever they might be playing around with. However, here is the problem and here is my issue. I want you to consider for a moment, what does Dungeons & Dragons as a game system, not what the GM is doing, not what your fellow players are doing, not what great module writers are doing, but what does Dungeons & Dragons, the core rules, do to encourage its player base to make nuanced decisions in storytelling, character creation, or player interaction? Because my answer to that is I don't think much. When I consider Blades in the Dark, for example, another role-playing game that I have come to greatly enjoy, it encourages adaptability. That is the one key word I think of when I think of Blades in the Dark that comes as a part of its flashback mechanic. It encourages players to adapt rather than to plan, and to shape stories rather than to plan around a pre-existing narrative because of the flashback mechanic. If something goes wrong, all I have to do is call for a flashback, and all of a sudden, I, not the GM, not my fellow players at the table, is the one shaping the narrative. This allows me as a player to consider not what's going on in the rule book or in the charts, but what I think would make for an exciting tale. That narrative adaptation on the fly, is something that feeds into the excitement and the fantasy of playing as a dashing, swashbuckling rogue, a ne'er-do-well, hopping along the rooftops of this haunted city. There are systems and frameworks that offer and facilitate interesting storytelling, and I just don't think Dungeons & Dragons is doing enough to push its players in those nuanced directions. D&D, in its interest of being accessible to as many players as possible, does nothing to challenge those players or to encourage them along nuanced storytelling paths. I want you also to consider, for example, Dread, another one of my favorite role-playing games. Dread encourages the players to buy into the narrative because of the Jenga tower that it is based around. As the Jenga tower teeters, as it totters, as players continue to move bricks around or blocks around, they are forced to consider the impact and the weight of their actions, and there is a real, tangible connection between the impact of the player's actions in the real world and the impact of the player's actions in game. I don't need to explain or show you a chart or have you look at 9 different pages of rules in order for you to understand you are in very real, very critical danger. You can look at the Jenga tower as it sways and understand that your decisions in game have impact. Again, this is a systemic and rules-driven choice that this system, Dread, is making to encourage players to buy into the fantasy that it creates. Dread is a horror game that aims to create tension, and its rules and the way that the game is set up creates that tension for the players. My argument is that Dungeons & Dragons, in its rules and systems, fails to do this. Fiasco is another great example. In terms of the players' buy-in, Fiasco, which in many cases touts itself as kind of being a movie scene, a Coen Brothers movie, encourages the players who are not active movers in a scene to play as the audience, determining whether or not a scene goes well or poorly for the characters involved therein, by thus increasing not only the buy-in from the other players, but allowing it to feel like it's a movie and encouraging the players to make choices they wouldn't normally make, because again, this isn't life or death. These are the goofy and in some cases tragically flawed characters who have more ambitions and no impulse control. These are not real people that we have to care about. And I think that framing device of allowing other players in order to get into those scenes has that same impact. These are 3 games whose rules and systems encourage nuanced storytelling, player interaction, and greater thinking and a greater depth of role-playing in a way that I don't feel like Dungeons & Dragons does, or even in my reflections, has ever done. But as foundational as these issues are, as much as I feel like Dungeons & Dragons does not, in its systems, encourage the type of deeper player interaction that I'm really looking for, I think the problem and the flaw goes even deeper than that. You see, for as wonderful and as simple as the D20 system is, the D20 system is part of the major problem. You see, when we use the D20 system, we are encouraging a pass-fail, a binary system of choices that I find to be uninteresting, and I would argue cause the story to go into a stalemate, or at the very least, to go into a very boring direction. And I'm going to explain exactly what I mean by that. Let's consider a player in the middle of mountain climbing in a D20 system like Pathfinder or like Dungeons & Dragons. The DM calls for a roll, a simple 15, in order for them to scale the side of the peak. They fail. What happens in this instance? Do they fall and thus are forced to make the check again, which is just merely stasis? If they're not under duress in a D20 system, they might just continue to do that over and over again. Do they fall and take a horrific amount of damage, thus injuring themselves and potentially eliminating part of this possibility, part of this problem, part of this issue? Or do they just remain on the side of the canyon? Either way you slice it, the player is forced to engage in either a completely new way of thinking, which could lead to something interesting, but if the player had a cool plan or an intriguing idea, or they were looking to, I don't know, engage in part of the core fantasy of their character, say, for example, a rock climbing or far-ranging barbarian, or a ranger that likes to scale cliffs in order to scout out new terrain, if they're trying to play out a core fantasy of it, being forced to take a completely new tack removes them from that fantasy. And if they're forced to just continue to roll over and over and over again, the story has just reached stasis. Ultimately, the D20 is the problem, and it is to blame here. A simple pass-fail on a D20 system isn't just boring, I think it's bad for good storytelling. The binary solution of this is what causes the story, and I would argue the game itself, to stagnate. In other systems, a failed roll is an opportunity for growth, player agency, or greater creativity. And as one person actually put it, and I really liked this, when you are allowing systems that force the player to fail forwards or fail interestingly, you are allowing them to shape the story, or giving yourself as a GM another opportunity to shift or change the story in new and interesting ways. Let's take a look at how Blades in the Dark would do this, for example. If you attempt to fall down, you could just call flashback and say that you bribed an alchemist to make you boots that adhere to a sheer surface. Now, all of a sudden, you have a new piece of intriguing gear, but in calling for that flashback, you have added danger to the clock and forced everybody in the situation to deal with the potential fallout that comes with your doomsday clock being filled. If we were looking at Dread, for example, let's say that you really botched this climb, and in Dread, if you haven't played it before, if the Jenga tower falls, your character either dies immediately or dies at some point at the GM's discretion. So let's say that the tower falls, but the GM allows your character to live, but the throbbing in their head, the blurring vision, lets you know that something is going on internally with your character that is going to end them at some point during the game, probably probably at a time that is going to be the most inconvenient, not just to you, but to everybody involved. In both of these situations, all that this has done, this framing device, has empowered other people to allow new information or interesting storytelling into the game. I actually included this little screenshot, which I found from a game designer discussion forum that I really liked. And I love this idea of empowering players to see what they want in the game, but opening yourself up to new possibilities when failure situations emerge from the fiction that you have created. This is something that the D20 system inherently does not allow. And again, as much as you could house rule this or add these solutions to your game, it's not rules as written. And as long as we continue to blindly adhere to the D20 system and its binary pass-fail nature, we are essentially limiting not just ourselves as GMs, but the players who participate in our games. But it's not just the core role-playing that I take umbrage with. No, D&D's combat also kind of sucks. I'll be completely honest, this is something that I have felt for a long time. And I think part of this is in the class divide, right? Because if you're choosing between a martial class and a casting class, you're really choosing between, do I want to have a lot of options for creative problem solving in combat, or do I want to have very little options in creative problem solving in combat? Now, don't get me wrong, there are specializations and new special or class features, and I do think the designers of D&D have tried to bridge the divide, but let's just take a look at what a first level wizard gets access to. Yep. That's just the spells. That is just the level 0 and the level 1 spells. Now, again, a wizard only gets to know 6 of them. However, you have 6 level 1 spells and a range of infinitely castable 0-level cantrips compared to the fighter's basic abilities. And this problem is really only exacerbated as levels continue to grow. It's something that I have noticed even entrenched D&D creators mention in their videos and in the content they make numerous times. There is a huge issue with the class divide, but that's not even my biggest problem. My biggest issue is that in many ways, combat in D&D just devolves into using the best ability ad nauseum. Those of you who have been longtime fans of Desks and Dorks content know that I think combat should be a puzzle, and I really love games that allow me to find unique and creative solutions every single time I engage in combat. It's part of the reason I like stuff like Darkest Dungeon, and here's the problem. The more I play D&D, the more I wish I was playing a different combat game. You see, other games have already started to try this. Hollows, a wonderful little game from Rowan, Rook, and Deckard, is playing around with just doing bosses for combat and treating every one of those combat encounters like a fight for your life, in which case your quote-unquote best ability might not necessarily be the tool that you need to solve the problem at hand. Another game that I think does combat better than anything, and again, I think this is part of the reason I hate D&D's combat so much, is Gloomhaven, because you can't just use your best ability, because once you've used an ability, it goes into the discard pile, and because every card, every ability has 2 parts to it. So a lot of times you are attempting to not just use the best one half of the card, but to find the best combination of top and bottom half for the solution at hand. When you couple this with the fact that you are working with players who have a similar puzzle to solve and changing mission objectives and changing rooms, you have a never-ending combat puzzle that is infinitely more engaging, strategic, and intriguing than anything Dungeons & Dragons has ever dreamed up in terms of its combat. Or, again, another dungeon crawler that I think does this really well is Perdition's Mouth, the Abyssal Rift. This is an obscure tactical dungeon crawler that I really love, but it eschews dice for this rondel system where your character, as marked by their own individual shield, can take an action in the rondel. For example, they can make an attack action, but once all of the spokes in that rondel are filled, that action cannot be taken by any other character in the role-playing game. This means that you as a team have to strategize about what moves to use and when, because not only do you need to spend movement movement to actually get across the dungeon, but movement is what allows you to move your shield across the rondel. This adds an added layer to the puzzle of how to defeat enemies in combat in ways that Dungeons & Dragons just never really does and never really encourages me to make. Again, as somebody who played a lot of 3.5, the memes about just cast magic missile till they're dead, or I cast fireball at the darkness, are memes because they're kind of true. At some point in combat, when your best ability is a hammer, every problem just starts to look like a nail. And it's one of the reasons that I find Dungeons & Dragons combat to bore me to tears. It does nothing interesting as a puzzle mechanic. And I find this especially egregious when we have had literally, 50 some years now of dungeon crawling development in the tabletop role-playing game industry and in the hobby in general. Please adapt some new concepts or new ideas to make this game feel fresh, because I'll be honest, if I have to cast Fireball 7 times in an encounter, I'm not playing the fantasy of a wizard. I'm playing a vending machine, and the only product I dispense is fire. But it's not just the combat system that I take some umbrage with. I also think that the class system is limiting. This actually comes from 2 places. This comes from my history as somebody who studied to be a medievalist, and from my background teaching in primary education. You see, one of the things that we learned pretty early on is to rotate class roles, or at the very least to never pigeonhole a child, because in doing so, what you can do is limit their understanding not just of the world, but of their role in it. And I think that actually D&D's class system does something similar to new or inexperienced role players, people who are just starting out on the RPG journey. Because when you get a system that says, hey, you are a fighter, you are a ranger, that means that you're not solving problems as somebody who is trying to find the most either nuanced solution or the best solution for the whole table, or a solution that fits within the story. You're trying to solve the problem in the way a fighter or a ranger would. Now, I can already hear someone saying, but Kyle, isn't that what you were complaining about before? The system isn't actually encouraging role-playing, but in this respect, it is. And I will say, yeah, it does. It gets you to, quote unquote, do what my character would do. But ultimately, I think the big issue with this is in a role-playing game setting. Do I want you thinking like a ranger, or do I want you thinking as if you are that individual character? And again, this is where the medievalist in me kicks in, because I know for a fact that our analogs to adventurers, the mercenaries, the adventurers of the real world, or the explorers of the real world, weren't specialists. They were generalists. They were individuals who worked really hard to stay alive and see just one more sunrise, or to see what was just beyond the next horizon. And so they wouldn't have turned their nose up at any advantage. They would have picked up a sword as readily as a crossbow. They would have thrown in with a talking bear as readily as they would have with a demon if it meant staying alive. And in that respect, I think the class system is severely limiting, particularly if you are new to role-playing and you don't have a framework for it. I think in general, it can lead to some bad habits that slowly get ingrained over the course of several different games. And I would much rather have a system that encourages a more holistic, creative problem-solving mindset than a class-specific one. And we're back to the camera, because I wanted to bring it back to me, because I feel like I need to say this with my whole chest. Part of my issue with Dungeons & Dragons has nothing to do with the game or the company, but rather with the community that surrounds it. You see, I liked playing D&D for a very long time, but as I found new role-playing games that I really was excited about, or interested in, or intrigued by, I realized that I wanted to bring these to the people that I played D&D with, and my response from those people resoundingly was, we are not interested in playing anything that isn't Dungeons & Dragons. And this has been something that feels like a pretty universal thing. When I taught D&D at conventions or at local game stores, and I tried to introduce new RPGs to those environments, a lot of times I had some people who were excited, but the majority, I would probably say 60 to 70%, were just like, if it's not D&D, why would I care? And ultimately, And I know this is not an issue with the game itself, but I take umbrage with the fact that we are limiting our horizons to one system made in the 1970s. Look, there is a wealth of incredible storytelling games, and I'm not just saying that as somebody who has a vested interest and runs a company that makes them. I'm telling you this as somebody who loves the medium and the form of storytelling. If you are only playing D&D, you are dramatically limiting not just your own creative horizons, but the ability for you to tell really impactful and intriguing stories in a number of different ways. And I'll be honest, this part of my presentation has been inspired by a comment that I got, because I make all of our videos setting and system agnostic, and I got a comment that essentially said, wow, you're really limiting your usefulness to the majority of your audience. And I'm gonna tell you this with my entire chest, I don't care. If you are only playing D&D, or if that's the only thing that you want, great, but I'm gonna sit here and encourage you to try some of the incredible amount of RPGs being made, not just by myself, but by other incredible independent creators, whether you go to itch.io or Indie Press Revolution or Exalted Funeral, whether you frequent stuff from Free League or Rowan Rook and Deckard or Wet Ink Games or us over here at Desks and Dorks. I really do appreciate it, but I think if you are only limiting yourself to what does exist on a D20, I think you're doing yourself a disservice, and you are missing out on an incredible wealth of adventures, friends, and opportunities that are existing just beyond those pages. It's a huge issue that I continually see with the D&D community at large, not necessarily with the indie RPG crowd nearly as much, who seem to be, at least on my experience, and again, this is purely anecdotally, but in my experience, they seem to be more willing to try new or off-the-wall things. Please, if you take one thing away from this video, even if you disagree with my core conceit, for the love of all that's good and holy, try something other than Dungeons & Dragons just once. As is our way, I'm going to round out the video with a couple recommendations. If you have been inspired by what I have talked about and you would like to try some indie tabletop RPGs, here are some recommendations I think you might particularly enjoy. 10 Candles is a post-apocalyptic horror role-playing game about losing your life during a world-ending cataclysm. Instead of hit points, you have candles around the room, and eventually you will snuff yourself out into darkness. It's a deeply evocative experience, and one that is really deeply enjoyable, and I really like this one. Fiasco is a game that I think I'm going to shout out probably until the day I die, but I love this particular one. This game has inspired me in most of the games that I work with and most of the games that I make. This does mean I am contractually obligated, however, to fight its author on a rooftop with katanas, just like in Highlander. So Jason Morningstar, please know that I'm gunning for you, but also I think this game is absolutely wonderful, lovely, and a rip-roarious good time, particularly if you care more about the journey rather than the destination. I'm going to throw Band of Blades a shout out. I talked about Blades in the Dark, but Band of Blades is essentially Band of Brothers through the lens of what if the Lord of the Rings thing happened where Sauron won, which I think is really deeply fascinating and really interesting. Johnny Chiodini, formerly of Dicebreaker, does a fantastic review of this. I think it's well worth checking out there. After the Rain, it's our game. It's only $8 over on itch.io, but if you're interested in a game that feels as dynamic in 2 hours as most D&D campaigns feel in 3 months, that's exactly what we wanted to do. We got rid of character stats, replaced them with memories, core experiences, and things that you lose as the game progresses. And I really think that's the coolest part about this. I wanted a game that felt like a total character arc in 2 hours, and I really think we've captured that. And again, it's like $8 over on itch.io, so for less than a Big Mac, you can get yourself a great game. Our friend Jex Thomas made this one. This is Bump in the Dark, the revised edition. I met Jex through the Symphony. They are a fantastic person and a great writer as well. But Bump in the Dark, a fantastic little game about protecting your town from the eldritch things that go bump in the night. Again, definitely worth a check out if you like horror RPGs or you're interested in something scrappy and entertaining. I'm going to throw Matt Orr and our friends over at Wet Ink Games a shout out for Never Going Home, a weird World War I RPG that I absolutely love. I think the tone and setting, the art, and the rule set is evocative and deeply thematic. I'm also going to throw our buddy Graham Gens and Under the Autumn Strangely, a pastoral storytelling game inspired by stuff like Over the Garden Wall. I'm going to throw that a shout out as well. And finally, I'm going to throw another shout out to a Desks and Dorks title, You've Always Lived in the Lighthouse. That one is aimed squarely at 2 players and aims at exploring a dynamic and evocative character relationship using a deck of 52 playing cards. All of these games, I think, are absolutely fantastic, and all of them are a wonderful introduction into the world of storytelling games in general. Whether you agree or disagree with my take that Dungeons & Dragons is a fundamentally broken system, and I think it truly is, I do hope, inevitably, that you will try a different, or perhaps other, role-playing game. If you like the content that we make here, a like, a comment, a share, a subscribe, all of the YouTube pleasantries do a really big deal for us, and I really appreciate it. But until next time, I am Kyle for Desks and Dorks. Thanks for watching. And, oh, you've been awesome. Peace. Pink Pony Club. I'm gonna keep on dancing at the Pink Pony Club. All right.